So, so what are aqueous foams? That's what I'm going to talk about now. So they're simply ensembles of air bubbles separated by films of water. So they come in a lot of configuration that you meet in everyday life. This is why I disagree with you, Jesus, when you say that for all the important fluids, non-Newtonian is not important. These are, for example, two-dimensional foams. This is a wet foam, so the bubbles are rather round, and when you squeeze the water out, you get a dry foam. Then you get these sort of more geometrical shapes. So one of the most basic parameters are going to be the water content, which is 1 minus what people call often in particular the petroleum engineering community, the foam quality. And the other basic parameter is going to be the foam texture, which is the average bubble size. So those foams, they are both a particular type, those foam flows are both a particular type of two-phase flow, and they are also a particular type of non-Newtonian complex flow. Okay? So the outline of my talk is first I'll introduce some fundamentals of foams, then I'll tell you why they are being used in the subsurface, and then I'll go to really the core of the talk, which is how they flow through a porous medium. So the topology of the 3D foam is a bit like this. Usually this is a rather dry foam. So for a dry foam like this, the films that contain the water meet usually at an angle close to 120 degrees along those plateau borders. And those plateau borders contain most of the water. Then the plateau borders will meet also at vertices. So the liquid can flow within the fields, but especially it can flow inside the plateau borders. So that is some type of drainage skeleton, and then there is a spontaneous evolution of the foam by gravitational drainage through the plateau border channels. Okay? There is also another mechanism of spontaneous evolution, which is coarsening due to diffusion of air of the gas, whatever it is, from the smaller bubbles to the adjacent larger bubbles. You know from the Young-Laplace law that the pressure is going to be more important in the small bubbles. Okay? So the small bubbles are going to be deflated, there's going to be diffusion of the gas, and then the larger bubbles are going to increase in size. There is also film ruptures, so it's in physics community it's called coalescence. This is much less clear in terms of causes, and when it's supposed to it can be predicted to happen. So the conclusion is that foams are not thermodynamically stable, they're metastable. And to improve that metastability, to make basically so that they remain for a longer time, we use surfactants. So surfactants, you're probably familiar with them. They're amphiphile molecules. They have one part which has an affinity for polar media, like water, another part which has an affinity to non-polar media. So they're going to sit at the interface of the water film, between the water film and the gas, and they're going to lower the surface tension. So the force is acting on a liquid film like that. Of course, there is gravity. There is capillary forces if there is where there is a radius of curvature of the interface. There are Marangoni's forces that result from surface tension gradients. For example, if the spatial distribution of the amphiphile is not homogeneous at the surface of the film, that explains surface elasticity. And then you also have steric repulsion. If you bring the two interfaces close to each other, too close to each other, then the amphiphile molecules are going to feel each other, they're going to repel each other. So altogether, you can define a total interaction energy between those two interfaces of the liquid film, and the disjoining pressure, which derives from that interaction energy. So here is, for example, typically the interaction energy, how it varies as a function of the thickness of the film. Okay, and this would then be the disjoining pressure. So in fact, this minimum here is going to be the metastable state of the film. If you narrow it, then you're going to have a positive disjoining pressure, which is going to bring it back to equilibrium here, sort of equilibrium. Okay, so what the surfactants do, they lower the surface tension, they lower the mechanical energy needed for foam formation, they increase interfacial viscosity, and they increase the disjoining pressure. Okay, so now how do bulk foams flow? When I mean bulk, what a bulk foam is, it's a foam where the typical size of the bubble is much smaller than the type of the typical length of the recipient of the flow cell. Okay, so when you make a bulk foam, when you apply stress to bulk foam, first there is a 10% elasticity range. Then from it you get to some plastic behavior and then flow, which means there is actually a yield stress. You need to overcome a yield stress for the foam to flow. And the flow phenomenology occurs is actually the flow is made of topological event like this one here. If you look here, you see there is a shear event. And so this is a typical, it's called a T1 event, and the entire shear flow consists of those events everywhere in the flow. So the viscous dissipation occurs at the boundaries between in the films actually, and that results in this non-Newtonian behavior. So at mesoscopic scale, you can describe. Hey, it's okay. So you can describe. You can describe the rheology like a Herschel-Berkeley rheology. So the stress is equal to the yield stress. Okay, so okay, so the result is that you get this Herschel-Berkeley rheology. This is an example of a good data set from the literature. You get an exponent that is between 0.25 and 0.40. Okay, so why do we use foams in the subsurface? They've been used originally in the oil industry and more recently in subsurface remediation. So in both cases, they allow reducing by 90% the needed volume of water. So they are usually created in situ, so you inject water and surfactants and gas. So one has little control on the foam texture or homogeneity. This is a sentence taken from a famous paper in the literature. Foam in porous media is a dispersion of gas in liquid where the liquid is discontinuous and at least some of the gas is made discontinuous by thin liquid film lamellae. So the films are often called lamellae in the literature. Here you see an example of liquid lamellae. And basically they will change the mobility of the gas completely. So a weak foam will be a foam where a significant portion of the gas flows in continuous gas channels like this, where there are no liquid lamellae. And a strong foam will be a foam where there are liquid lamellae everywhere. Okay, so today I'm going to consider only strong foams. So it's been also used in steam EOR. Basically, that's how it was discovered. Because in steam EOR, you want to reduce the viscosity in the oil by injecting steam and heating up the oil. And in fact, they realized that they were actually creating a foam in the medium. Okay, I will not spend too much time because I've wasted a bit of time now. Now they're being used a lot in remediation. So the remediation of non-aqueous phase liquids in aquifers basically is the same process as it was very close to EOR. But in the remediation of the Vadel zone, the injection fluid is used to carry chemical amendments that will act on the pollutant. So there is also a focus on a homogeneous sweep, but there are other benefits to foam, for example, capacity to selectively transport colloidal particles, the fact that it brings air and it can help if you do bioremediation, and other things, including also a very weak sensitivity to gravity. This is an experiment with a soil from a polluted site in the US, and with the foam, you actually have a much more uniform sweep because it's much less sensitive to gravity. So let's go now to the flow the flow of foam in a model porous medium. So the macroscopic view is the Darcy law. We've talked a lot about it today. And so if you measure a head drop, or by imposing a flow rate, for example, and you want to write the Darcy law, if you change the head, the flow rate that you impose, you get a different. To write the Darcy law, you need a viscosity, which is an effective viscosity, which actually depends on the velocity. So we go back to what Michel was explaining before, in that case. And so if you plug this back into the Darcy law, you get this nonlinear relationship where the Darcy velocity, or the mean velocity, apparent velocity, is proportional to the pressure the head drop to a power 3.5, sorry. Okay? So the thing is that when the foam flows in channels which have dimension on the same order as the foam bubble size, most of the dissipation occurs in the wall films. And in particular in the plateau borders. So you have a wall like this, you're going to have a film. So this is a lamella that is perpendicular to the wall. Okay, and basically everything is going to occur here. So we study the foam flow in 2D in experiments where we can visualize the structure of the foam as it flows. So that means with three configuration. So this is really the most simple configuration, which I'll use to evidence the control of the flux by the foam structure. With that configuration, we can evidence the influence of elasticity and capillary effect on the flow. And this is a geometry which is more akin to a random porous medium. And there are a number of different phenomenological effects that we can discuss. So the experiment is based on a Halo show. So basically it's two glass plates. And the bubbles the foam is prepared upstreams. The bubbles are squeezed between the two glass plates. So that's what we call a two-dimensional foam. There is one layer of bubbles, which is why we can visualize everything in terms of structure. This is one of the toy models we used at the beginning. So the only measurement we do is taking pictures of the foam structure as it flows. Okay, so this is an example of two channels. There is one obstacle here that we can move sideways. This is a bulk foam in terms of structure. Here two bulk foam. Now if I bring that obstacle closer, I get a particular structure, which is here what we call a stairway structure. Here, and there is also a bamboo structure starting. If we bring it even closer, it's a perfect bamboo. So when we do this, actually, we measure the ratio of the velocities in the two channels as a function of the ratio of the width of the channel. We have sharp transitions between structures. There is a sharp drop in the ratio, and then it grows again. So how to explain those things? We explain it simply by understanding that the friction can be counted as the sum of the friction of all the films on the solid walls. So if a film is moving like this, seen from above, this is a vertical film, there is maximum friction. If it's moving like this, there is no friction. So in fact, the friction is proportional to the component of the velocity of the film that is perpendicular to the film itself here, to the power 2/3. And it's also proportional to the projected length of the film on the direction perpendicular to its flow, to its velocity. So this law was first shown by Brotherton on on bubbles moving through a tube. It's a very famous paper, and then it has been also shown on bamboo foams later on. It has been proven at the scale of the film. So if we sum all those contributions, we have the viscous pressure drop in this, across the porous medium. And there is a prefactor, there is a numerical prefactor that can be estimated either theoretically, statistically, or by analyzing the structure of the foam. So we do both, and I won't spend much time, but if we have the full analytical prediction show this decrease and then this sharp decrease at the transition, and then increase and then sharp decrease and so on, and these are full prediction in red. That means the numerical prefactor is computed from the data, and this is just the data of velocity. So that means that the takeaway idea in this is that the foam structure will control the distribution of fluxes between channels in the porous medium. So now, if we consider that that obstacle that is inclined, if we flow from left to right or from right to left, this is what we don't get exactly the same thing. So, for example, here we flow from left to right. Here we are squeezing the bubbles vertically because we have to decrease the number of bubbles across the thickness here. And here is the contrary. So here they're elongated vertically, here they squeeze horizontally. And that changes, actually, that impacts the velocity. So there is a ratio. Though the geometry is completely symmetrical, we completely lose the flow reversibility in that case due to elastic effects. So what we get is that the flow kinematics constrains the bubble deformation, which then constrains the viscous friction, which controls the flux ratio in this. So now, moving to a configuration with cylindrical grain that is random and computer generated, we treat the images so as to obtain, basically to be able to track every individual bubbles and obtain velocity map and also area maps. Okay, so we have different parameters. We did 45 experiments. We have a parameter which is the average initial average bubble, then the average flow velocity in particular, and we have also the foam quality or the water content. Okay, so this is the phenomenology. Here with small initial bubbles, large initial bubbles. So what do we see here? First of all, we see that there are some preferential flow paths, clearly, and there are areas that hardly move. And so there is also intermittency in time. So even though we're forcing it in a completely stationary manner, the local flow is very intermittent due to capillary.
Is the same top and bottom?
Sorry?
Is the pressure the same top and bottom in the two experiments?
So no, it's not. So what we impose is the flow. The flow rate is the same.
But the pressure will be different.
Yeah, the pressure will be different. And the fluctuation in pressure will be even more different. So, yes?
So is there like some value of pressure beyond which these bubbles entirely break up and coalesce? So is there some critical pressure which you shouldn't go beyond?
No, but I'll come to it because we are studying in detail the breakup of the fragmentation of bubbles. So here is the local velocities average over 100 seconds. So you see the preferential flow path. The PDF also shows that there are some negative velocity at some places because there are some forth and back oscillations of small bubbles. Those trapped small bubbles can be here cover about 18% of the porous space. And the explanation for the preferential path is really classic. And there are some pores are larger, and then so some of them are connected, and it finds its way. So this is not really specific to the non-Newtonian fluid. But now, if we look at the bubble areas here, maps of bubble areas, we see that it's correlated to the map of bubble velocities. So actually, larger bubbles follow the path of high velocities. This also shows in the PDF. So the consequence, if we go back to this relationship, nonlinear relationship between the apparent mean velocity and the head difference here, is that there is a prefactor here, alpha, which is known to depend on the bubble size. But the bubble sizes are heterogeneous because the larger bubbles follow large, faster paths, which means that here there is actually a hidden dependence on velocity, which I've never seen reported on before. So this actually tends to lessen, to weaken let's say the exponent or the deviation from the Newtonian behavior of the fluid at a macroscopic scale. Okay, so the intermittency is shown here at a given velocity, and when we increase the velocity, we see those preferential flow path channels which are intermittent, and they start to actually occupy a larger part of the space. So they become denser. So what we see here also in the velocity, in the maps of bubble areas, is that here it's yellow, here it's red. That means actually the mean bubble size at the outlet here, it's much smaller. This is the inlet, this is homogeneous, this is the outlet, it's very heterogeneous. So the inlet has a PDF or distribution of sizes that is like this, and the outlet has a distribution of sizes that is like that. Okay? So the medium has kind of selected the bubble size. So what we did is we computed the PDF, the distribution of bubble sizes along the length, so as to get a continuous description. So as a function of the travel distance in the medium, the distribution, the initial symmetrical peak decreases here, and the new distribution chosen by the median is created. Okay? Yes?
I have a question. How did you determine the bubble size? Because like at the end you can see that you have this anisotropic bubble. Did you choose the area, or what did you choose as a parameter? Yeah,
it's the area, because the thickness is the same everywhere. So we compute the area, actually the size. Yeah. So there are different mechanisms of lamella creation for foam that are known, and the one that is dominant in our system is this lamellar division. Here this bubble is being squeezed by another one against a fragmenting obstacle, and then it gets divided in two. Okay? In our system, because of the geometry, the other mechanisms do not exist. In particular, this bubble coalescence by capillary friction does not exist. 10? Yeah. So this is the only mechanism, this is really the dominant mechanism. So we're going to be able to study it in detail. We compute the efficiency of fragmentation. This is the initial mean bubble size. This is the final mean bubble size. The difference of them normalized by the initial mean bubble size. If you have 0, nothing happened. If it's 1, everything has fragmented. The bubbles are of 0 size at the end. So we show this as a function of the mean initial bubble size for different velocities and for 3 ranges of water quality of the water content. And you see that actually there is clearly a dependence on the initial bubble size, sort of monotonic, but there is absolutely no dependence on the velocity, right? No correlation between the position of the points and their color. So basically, it's mostly controlled by the mean initial bubble size and the water content. So we are going to model this fragmentation model in the following manner. This is a fragmentation event. We have a bubble of size A, it fragments into a bubble of size B and a bubble of size A minus B. Why? Because the foam is actually incompressible. So the overall size is conserved. So we want to describe this function n of ax, which is the number of bubbles in the longitudinal range x plus delta x, which have a size between a and a plus delta a. So basically, that's the surface that I showed you. Okay? And actually, they evolve because of fragmentation, which are actually defined by a probability that a bubble of size A breaks in the range x and x plus delta x. And then another statistical function which gives you the distribution of the sizes B when a bubble of size A fragments. So this is so there are some constraints of G because of the conservation of the volume and everything. So you can write an equation for the conservation of the bubble population. The derivative of n as a function of x, the longitudinal position, will come from the fact that bubbles of sizes A, part of them will actually fragment and disappear with a frequency f of A. But also bubbles that are larger than A, of size B larger than A, are going to fragment some of them into bubbles of size A, which will bring a positive term. Okay, so this is a standard equation in fragmentation models. We haven't invented it. So we can do analytical treatment on this, and so we don't know what these functions are. So we start with a power law for F, and for G of B of A, we say, okay, all daughter sizes are equivalent. And if we do this, we see that we actually get a distribution that looks a bit like the one we had experimentally. We have quite a few assumptions to make things a bit simpler here. So, for example, this is completely non-physical. But what we can do is actually a full numerical simulation. When we do the full numerical simulation, we see indeed the initial peak decreasing and then the new distribution arising here. So when we do the simulation, we non-dimensionalize the equation, and we actually consider to do this. We consider the character length that is the inverse of the fragmentation frequency of the initial bubble size. This is this thing here. So at the beginning, you only have bubble of sizes A0, so you only have this, and this is just an exponential decrease. So the initial peak decreases exponentially at the beginning, and from this you will get the f of A0. So what we do is we want to actually determine f and g. So we find sites where it fragments a lot, and we follow them by image analysis, and we measure the frequency of fragmentation, which is here, which is actually a power law of exponent close to 2. And then from the exponential decrease of the initial peak here, we get the prefactor here, f of A0. And then we measure also the distribution of the size of the daughter bubbles like this. And then we plug this in the direct simulation, and we compare that to the data. So and you see that it's working pretty well. Okay, so that means that all the assumptions that we made are correct, and we understand what's going on. We do that for all experiments, and it's working. So the data is in color, and the models are rather consistent with the data. But another thing, and that's my last slide, another thing is that because the process is described as this non-dimensional equation, if f and g are the same for all experiments, which is what we assume, then this n of the renormalized A and the renormalized x should not depend on the experiment at a fixed x normalized x. So if we renormalize properly everything, we can actually superimpose the data from all experiments at a given normalized x, and they should collapse on top of each other. And indeed they do. And so the conclusion of this is that everything is controlled by the geometry of the medium. The geometry of the medium controls the evolution of the size distribution. Yes?
So the main equation you're using is not a Fokker-Planck equation of evolution of probabilities. This is a fragmentation equation of some sort.
Yeah, it looks like the Shmolevsky equation.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if this is not, because you don't have, for example, diffusion of gas between bubbles. No, you're right. So because I was a bit fast on that, but the coalescence is not taking into account because it's so slow that within the time scale of our experiment, actually this goes back to the fact why all the other processes of either creation or disappearance of lamella are not relevant in our system. So if you did a flow over 10 hours, then you would have to take that into account. Scales that are relevant to EOR and so on.
I mean, also the scale would be
This,
would be a player here.
yeah, the scale will matter. Yeah, but yeah. So, yeah, so in the end, I won't go, I'm already late, so, but the prospects of that is now to consider different media with different geometries and try really to relate the dynamics to the geometry, okay? And I want to finish by thanking, these are 4 papers that we published on those things, and I'd like to thank my co-authors. This is a collaboration with my colleagues Benjamin Dolay, Isabelle Cantard at Institute of Physics of Rennes. Benjamin is now in Grenoble. And we had 2 young people, 2 postdocs who did a really good job, work on this. So a lot of I mean, they're the main persons here.
Why you chose like 4 CMC as concentration of surfactant?
So the CMC, the critical micelle concentration. So it's the concentration at which the interface is going to be, the interfaces are going to be saturated with surfactants. Then micelles are created inside, and you're sure that basically you will have the homogeneous properties of the in surface tension. So that's why we choose something that is significantly above the critical micelle concentration. It has to be, because otherwise you never know what locally is your surface tension, which is really a problem.
But basically then you don't have all of those Marangoni forces because your like concentration is super high.
I don't have Marangoni forces, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you don't have that.
No, I hope I don't have Marangoni forces. Yeah, of course, because this is complicated enough, so if I start having Marangoni effects...
when you presented the model, you said that the foam is incompressible, if I heard correctly?
Yeah, so that the foam is actually incompressible, yes. So this is a question.
Like this is compressible, but the pressure in your system doesn't change much.
So low.
That's why.
Yeah, I mean, this is always this is a question I get all the time. So this is actually very interesting. This is a question I already got from Dorothée when I gave a seminar in Zurich some months back. So actually, in the foam literature, you see that people will argue that, like in many cases of fluid dynamics, it falls down to what the Mach number is. So the Mach number is not high enough so that it would be, you would have to be considered uncompressible. And actually, after that question, I went back to the theory. So why the Mach number enters the picture, and actually it's wrong because we're not in a flow configuration where to obtain the Mach number in the thought process, you need to consider a pressure term that is not relevant here, which is relevant for high Reynolds flow, for example. So in that case, this is not relevant, but if you do the proper calculation, you also find that it's incompressible still.
But I think if you put it in the Proust media, then you have maybe like somehow pressure gradient, and that may govern the bubble size a lot like this.
That may govern the
bubble size, yeah.
No, it won't. No, it won't. So, but this we actually measure because we can compare the A to the sizes, the sum of the sizes of the daughter bubbles, and it works extremely well. It's conserved. So we have an experimental proof of this.
So you think it's independent of pressure?
Yes. In the range that we consider in our experiments, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
In subsurface application or reservoir engineering, the foam are used as a blocking agent.
Yeah, yeah.
And in my mind, these mechanisms was essentially due to capillary section. Is it still true in your view?
I don't know. What people say basically, you're talking about divergent mechanism basically. So what they do, I'll explain because it's in the talk, but I skipped it because I was late. So basically, what the divergent mechanism is people are going to send foam. It's going to go through the high permeability regions, and then it's going to stay there, and then they're going to send water again, and then it's going to be diverted to low permeability regions because the foam is already there with lamellas that actually reduce a lot the mobility in the high permeability regions.
Why is it that foam stays in the... I mean, when you inject, it goes
well, that's
potentially everywhere.
Well, when you inject, it goes faster to the high permeability regions.
It's shear thinning, essentially?
Yeah, and it's a way, it's a bit local, it's a type of local shear thinning, I would say.
But
yeah.
to send the solution also goes also through the... so most of the time they don't inject foam, they just inject...
that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
So foam is created and
yeah.
it's more stable in the permeability.
Yeah, I mean, I don't claim that I understand everything in this because actually the foam is generated in the medium, which is another complicated story. For example, when you generate the foam in the medium, you get that type of mechanism, which is the leave behind, which is going to create we don't have that at all in our system. So.
Is it possible to have micromolars that would have that?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, the leave behind is basically it occurs at foam generation. So you send the gas here, the liquid is saturating, the gas is coming and it's kind of pushing the liquid, and then it's leaving some lamella here behind the, and that you can only have this if the two faces are separated from the start, right? So this is typically a mechanism that you have at foam generation, but not at foam flow once it's generated. And we can do that also in the micromodel. Yes, we can.
Yeah. One more question from.
If you have a 3D geometry and so like a 3D foam,
Yeah.
how much do you expect that to change your population?
It will not change it much, except that you will have much less fragmentation. Because pinning a bubble against an obstacle is going to be much more difficult. I think, that's my guess. So we have planned experiments in columns, except we won't have local observations, so we will do that just at the outlet. And by varying the length of the medium, we can actually look at different penetration depths. So this is something we have planned. Yeah. Yes?
Consider the spatial distribution of the grain sizes. I mean, the variance and also the spatial correlation. Because you talk about defragmentation, I just wonder, for example, if at the beginning the channels are very narrow, then we get fragmentation. But if the channels get wider, will there be a reverse process?
Yeah, so reverse process, no. Not if there are no other mechanism that can actually merge coalesce bubbles together. But you're right that if you have, when the bubbles are too small, they do not fragment. They cannot fragment. You see from the mechanism that clearly there is a limit lower size under which they will not fragment. So what's going to happen in our distribution is that distribution, if we had a much longer medium, that distribution would sort of pile up here. At the end, you'd get a direct distribution. They would all be at the lower limit size, bubble size, and then there would be no fragmenting anymore.
Spatial distribution that he's asking.
So the final state will be the same. But the transition between this and the direct will be impacted by the distribution of pore sizes. That's your question, right? And so that's exactly what we would like to do in the future. So have controlled geometries and see how changing that distribution is or pore next impacts the process.
Okay, so if the medium is not long enough, then probably the spatial correlation will not be that important. I mean, if you sample enough, if you have enough sample, enough
So
volume is long enough, of course medium is long enough, so you said that in the end it will not matter.
in the end, the final state will always be the sort of lower limit size. But you're talking about spatial correlation of the medium itself. Huh? So because you could think of a medium that has no significant spatial correlation above the size of the grain. And we would start with something that doesn't have spatial correlation. It's already complicated enough. So, yeah. But of course, then, yeah. Sorry. Yeah.